The middle section of the brainstem is the pons. So the superiormost portion that we've already learned about is the midbrain, which contains two bumps called the superior colliculus. These are the visual reflex centers. Inferior to that is the inferior colliculus, which are the auditory reflex centers. And collectively, all four of those make up the corpora quadrigemina. Just inferior to that is the pons, which is the middle region of the brain stem, and it contains autonomic nuclei, which are responsible for breathing. They help to regulate breathing. And then the inferiormost portion of the brainstem would be the medulla oblongata, which is then continuous with the spinal cord. So the spinal cord essentially begins in this region. Just to remind you, directly superior to the brainstem is the diencephalon, containing the thalamus, the epithalamus, which is the pineal gland, and the hypothalamus, which is not shown in this particular diagram. The most inferior region of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata, commonly just referred to as the medulla, and it's the most caudal part of the brainstem, continuous with the spinal cord. So remember, for the central nervous system, we use the term caudal instead of inferior, but it essentially means the same thing. The medulla contains autonomic nuclei and reflexes which are necessary to sustain life. For example, the cardiac center regulates heart rate and its strength of contraction. The vasomotor center controls blood pressure by regulating contraction and relaxation, as well as the medullary respiratory center, which regulates respiratory rate. So this respiratory center regulates respiratory rate, and then the pons is going to modify that respiration. Other important reflexes in the medulla are reflexes for coughing, sneezing, salivation, swallowing, gagging, or vomiting. So whenever the body is exposed to something potentially harmful, the medulla has a reflex center that can help us to get rid of that potentially harmful substance. And the last region of the brain is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain, and it has the posterior part of the fourth ventricle. Remember that the fourth ventricle is actually runs just between the pons and the cerebellum. So it's partitioned into three layers. It has an outer gray matter, which is called the cerebellar cortex, an internal region of white matter called the arbor vitae, as well as other cerebellar nuclei. So we've talked about the brain. The last part of your chapter is on cranial nerves, and there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They're numbered using Roman numerals by position, starting anterior and moving to posterior. And the names of the nerves generally relate to the function. So oftentimes you can figure out what the function is just based on the name. Some of the cranial nerves contain only motor or sensory neurons, but other cranial nerves have both motor and sensory neurons, so incoming and outgoing signals. And recall that spinal nerves, for example, are mixed nerves like this. Mixed nerves means that they have both motor and sensory pathways. An example of a purely sensory neuron would be something like the olfactory nerve, which is cranial nerve number 1, because it takes sensory information from the nose, conducting it into the brain. Also, cranial nerve 2 is called the optic nerve, takes sensory information from the retina, communicates it into the brain. The motor components of the cranial nerve may either be somatic, motor, or they could be parasympathetic motor in function. And a good example of this would be cranial nerve number 10, which is the vagus nerve. These are the primary functions of the cranial nerves, and you should know the names of them as well as their general function, whether they're sensory or motor or both. So cranial nerves number 1 and 2, I've already mentioned. Cranial nerve 1 is called olfactory, and so its function would be olfaction or smell. Notice that it has none of these two. Cranial nerve number 2 would be vision. Cranial nerve 3 is called the oculomotor, and it is primarily going to be just motor. So notice that it has no sensory function. So its motor control would be extrinsic eye muscles. You don't need to know the specific names of the muscles. And its parasympathetic fiber would be to constrict the pupils. And remember that parasympathetic means rest and digest. So the events that would happen would be responsible for basically relaxation. It would be the opposite of fight or flight. If you are in relaxation mode, your pupils don't need to be dilated. That would be the function of the sympathetic nervous system, which you'll have a chapter on later on in the semester. The fourth cranial nerve is called the trochlea, and it has no sensory function. It controls an eye muscle. Notice that it has no sensory, so wherever there's no, I'm going to highlight it in a different color. The fifth cranial nerve is called the trigeminal nerve, and it has sensory information basically from the nasal cavity, nasopharynx, face, anterior two-thirds of the tongue, and it also has a motor function, which is chewing or mastication. So I'm only highlighting that which you really need to put on your index card. The sixth cranial nerve is called the abducens nerve. It has no sensory function, and its motor function would be a muscle of the eye. And again, you don't need to know the names of the muscle of the eye. Just know that they are extrinsic eye muscles. These two are extrinsic eye muscles. Cranial nerve number 7 is the facial nerve, and it's taste from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, just like the trigeminal nerve. Its motor function would be facial expressions, and its parasympathetic function would be secretion from the lacrimal gland of the eye, as well as salivary glands. And that kind of makes sense because even if you're thinking about food, your salivary glands are going to start to secrete saliva. For the last 6 cranial nerves, we have cranial nerve 8 called the vestibulocochlear nerve. Again, the ones that don't have either a sensory motor or a parasympathetic branch, I'm just going to highlight with a light green. Its sensory function is hearing and balance, which is equilibrium. Cranial nerve 9 is called the glossopharyngeal nerve, and its sensory function is going to be taste as well from the back of the tongue, and it also controls a pharyngeal muscle and parotid salivary glands. So as long as you know that it is salivation, not salvation, excuse me. The 10th cranial nerve is going to be called the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve we refer to as the great wanderer. Some texts will refer to it as the vagabond. It's the only cranial nerve that actually extends out of the brain into both the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. So it controls the heart, lungs, abdominal organs, as well as many others. It's going to control digestion. So it makes sense that it is parasympathetic. It's going to control smooth muscle and glands of the heart, lungs, larynx, trachea, and abdominal organs. And in fact, it's 90% of parasympathetic nervous system fiber. So it's the most significant of the parasympathetic fibers. It also controls pharyngeal muscles and laryngeal muscles. The accessory nerve is cranial nerve 11. It has no sensory function, but its motor function is the trapezius muscle and the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And finally, cranial nerve 12 is the hypoglossal muscle, which is essentially tongue muscles. I know this is a lot to remember, so there are a lot of memory tricks. If you just Google mnemonic and cranial nerves, you'll find one. One that I like to use is O once, let me write it over here. O once one takes the anatomy final very for vestibulocochlear good vacations are heavenly. Something that sounds really good probably after this class. And like I said, there are others that you can look at. There are some that are not as G-rated, which I can't write here, but others, which you may remember more easily.